we're not seeing a 1979 style revolution, nor are we on the brink of an imminent regime collapse.
You've got US and Israel on one side, and their stance has been clear since day one. Then you've got Russia and China on the other side. Clearly, they've backed Iran through all these years. I want to know about the other players, the middle players.
So, when I say that Iran is breaking, I mean that the Islamic Republic is currently undergoing a slow but profound structural fracture rather than an imminent collapse. An unstable Iran right now would create massive economic risk for Dubai, for the UAE. Refugee flows for Turkey would be a nightmare because Turkey has taken Syrian and Iraqi and Afghan refugees by the millions.
Welcome to FO Talks. With me is Abdullah Hayek. He's a Young Voices contributor and an independent Middle East analyst based in Washington, D.C. Welcome, Abdullah. How are you?
I'm good, Rohan. Thank you. It's great to be here again.
Glad to have you back. Today, let's talk about Iran. You've been writing a lot about Iran, Abdullah, and you've written something that has really caught my eye. You say that Iran is on the verge of breaking, but not the way that the US imagines. What do you mean by that?
So, when I say that Iran is breaking, I mean that the Islamic Republic is currently undergoing a slow but profound structural fracture rather than an imminent collapse. Washington often imagines that breaking is a moment of sudden regime failure or mass defections or a single revolutionary rupture that clears the board in its essence. What is happening in Iran right now is different. I think the system is eroding from within across legitimacy, economics, governance, social cohesion in ways that are cumulative and very hard to reverse. This makes Iran, in my opinion, brittle, but not weaker in the simplistic sense that the US has traditionally tended to measure in. So, in the first layer of breakage, it's legitimacy. The Islamic Republic no longer commands consent across the majority of the segments of its own population, particularly the younger Iranians today who have no memory of the revolution, the Iran-Iraq war, or the ideological justifications that once sustained that system. For them, the regime is not a vehicle of resistance or dignity, but actually it's an obstacle to normal life. It's an obstacle to economic opportunity, to personal autonomy. It's an obstacle to their dreams. This is not a temporary mood. It's really a generational shift. But nonetheless, the state still governs, and it does so increasingly through coercion rather than just belief, which is, in my opinion, I think, a critical distinction. Second, Iran is breaking economically. It's breaking economically in ways that are structurally corrosive rather than spectacular. And the sanctions matter, the American sanctions matter, but they're not just the whole story. Decades upon decades of Iranian mismanagement, corruption, foreign adventurism, patronage networks, and just the overall militarization of their whole economy has really hollowed out the productive sectors, while it at the same time enriched a very narrow elite. And it's mainly the government, the IRGC, the Ayatollahs, a very small segment of their society. Inflation, currency instability, declining purchasing power, all of this has become permanent features of daily life for the Iranian people. And this creates a society that is exhausted, is tired, it's really angry, but it's also risk averse, and it's really cynical about the promises of reform.
Right, Abdullah, you said something very interesting. You said that the people today do not really know about the 1979 revolution. However, we are also seeing some videos which are coming from Iran where people are talking about the lion and the sun flag, which basically talks about how people are trying to reach back into history. So are we witnessing another 1979 like revolution, or are we looking at just a regime collapse because of mismanagement?
The short answer is no. We're not seeing a 1979 style revolution, nor are we on the brink of an imminent regime collapse. The
Hmm.
conditions that produced the Islamic Revolution of 1979 do not exist today. And projecting that historical template onto contemporary Iran today obscures more than it explains.
Hmm.
What we're seeing instead is a prolonged legitimacy crisis without a revolutionary vehicle that is capable of seizing power or restructuring the state as a whole. The 79 revolution succeeded because it united vastly different social forces around a single charismatic leadership and a clear ideological alternative. We had clerics, leftists, bazaar merchants, students, the poor, everyone in Iran was bound together by a shared opposition to the Shah, and that in return rallied around Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini, who in turn offered both religious authority and a coherent political vision. Today in Iran, there is no equivalent figure. There is no unifying ideology. There is no organizational infrastructure that is capable of translating the protests into power, into a power transition process. The opposition exists, but it is fragmented, it's decentralized, it's intentionally leaderless. And what Iranians are facing today is fundamentally different than the Shah's regime. The Islamic Republic was built to survive mass unrest. That's a fact that many people tend to neglect. It has layered security institutions, parallel chains of authority, and decades of experiencing uh, the suppressing dissent of its own people. The military and the security services in Iran right now are not alienated from the regime in the way the Shah's army eventually was in its final days. On the contrary, their economic interests, their political power, their institutional survival are deeply tied to the system's continuation, which makes, in my opinion, elite defection, which is the classical trigger for collapse, far less likely.
So tell us more of what's really happening in Iran. We've seen reports, we've seen news articles about thousands of people who've been killed. How is this playing out across the country and Iranian society in general?
Look, the movement in Iran right now is best understood, in my opinion, not as a single uprising, but as a diffuse. It's a society-wide expression of accumulated frustration that cuts across the whole Iranian scene through geography, through class, through gender and ethnicity, but it does not resemble the tightly organized revolutionary movements of the past, nor does it depend on the centralized leadership or ideology that fueled the past.
Hmm.
Instead, it reflects a broad social awakening in which different groups articulate overlapping grievances in their own language, in their own timing, in their own spaces. And I think that decentralized character is both, it both has pros and cons, let's say that. Geography, the protests are not confined to Tehran. We've seen that. The protests have spread to all 31 provinces in Iran. They're emerging in the cities, in the towns, in the villages that really sat at the margins of national politics, in the minority areas, in the Azeri areas, in the Baluchi areas. The economic protests over water shortages, wages, fuel prices, housing prices, they frequently merge with political demands, which really blurs the line between material and ideological dissent. In particular, in the ethnic minority areas, in the Kurds, the Baluch, the Arabs, the Azeris, the local identity and the long-standing grievances really intersect with national anger, which creates, in my opinion, a region-specific expression that is resistance, but nevertheless it resonates with the broader population that is mostly Persian.
Hmm.
And I think something that's also important to mention is that there's a lot of labor unrest. We have teachers, we have oil workers, we have pensioners, civil servants These people are going to the streets more than what we've seen before, and it's often outside the media spotlight. And these actions are not always framed as political, but they are inherently so, in my opinion.
Right. Well, let's say that these protests continue. What are the paths that Iran can take then?
That's a very it's a very hard question to answer. But if we were to dig deep into it right now, I would say that as the protests continue, Iran faces several plausible paths forward, which none of them resemble a clean or linear transition.
Hmm.
The Iran after the protests will never be the Iran before. That's just a fact. And I think right now the most likely trajectory is not a dramatic transformation, but rather an enhanced management of instability. And I say that in which the regime will survive, but society will continue to push and to probe and to resist in uneven ways. We have an example of that in recent memory in 2021 when we had the Mahsa Amini protests,
Hmm.
which a young Kurdish Iranian woman was killed for not wearing a headscarf, a hijab. We've seen that Iranian women have been defiantly not wearing the hijab, and it's become a constant. It's a regular sight in Iran right now where people just don't really want to make it that important to tell women what to wear. It's an example, and we'll see that in this current situation. Now, this path is defined by endurance on both sides, in my opinion. It's really it's a marathon rather than a sprint, to say. And in this scenario, the protests will persist intermittently, flaring around specific triggers. These triggers include economic shocks, social restrictions, symbolic incidents. Uh, the state will retain control of the institutions, the security forces, the territorial integrity will remain the same. I don't think we're going to see an independent republic of Baluchistan or a greater Azerbaijan. This will ultimately, though, create a cycle of unrest that
Hmm.
never fully resolves. And as I said before, Iran has already been living in this mode because the regime was designed to sustain that. And the system has shown that it can function, albeit poorly, but still it can function under these conditions. And I think there's another path that we have to take note to. It's partial adaptation without meaningful reform. What does that mean? It means that the leadership in Iran right now may attempt selective adjustments to relieve pressure, where it will limit social easing, it will, you know, try to make some economic relief, stipends, it will try to do that. But these measures won't be designed to transform the system, but they'll just be buying time and reduce the immediate tensions that we're seeing right now. And historically, not just in Iran, but throughout the region, such steps have failed to restore the legitimacy. We've seen that in Saddam Hussein's Iraq in the aftermath of the Gulf War. It never worked. But they can lower the protest intensity, but for a very short period of time. Uh, a third possibility is increasing the securitization of governance, which I think this is one of the most dangerous paths. And as social trust erodes right now in Iran, the state may lean even more heavily on coercive institutions to maintain order. But this does not necessarily mean mass violence, but it does mean a greater role for the surveillance, intelligence, and preemptive repression. But the danger here
Hmm.
is that over securitization can deepen resentment and accelerate long term decay. Even as it suppresses short term unrest, the system will become stable on the surface, but very, very, very hollow underneath.
Right. Abdullah, the last time we spoke, you spoke about Syria and the kind of fragmentation that Syria was seeing. You told us about Arabs, you told us about the Kurd population, the Alawites, and the Druze, and how they were now controlling their own enclaves in Syria. Now, you've spoken about similar lines in Iran as well. You've talked about You talked about the Baluchis. You talked about the Farsi people, the Persian people, the Arab people in Iran. We've also spoken about how there are Azeris in Iran. So, are we going to see what's happening in Syria play out in Iran as well? And what I mean by that is, are we going to see more fragmentation in Iran going forward?
When you open the subject of Syria, I can never stop talking about it. But it's a good mirroring of what we're seeing on the ground in Iran right now. But I think the prospect of having Iran fragmenting into a full-on civil war
Hmm.
or disintegrating along the lines of the Syrian civil war is often raised, but fundamentally it misreads both Iran's internal structure and the nature of its current unrest.
Hmm.
While Iran right now is unstable, it is not unraveling the way Syria did. And the drivers of the protests today really don't align with the conditions, with the factors that produced state collapse or prolonged civil war in Syria. The risks that Iran faces are serious nonetheless, but they're different. They're really
Hmm.
different. Syria's descent into civil war was driven by a multitude of factors that do not exist in Iran.
Hmm.
The Syrian state lost territorial control very early on in the war. The army fractured along sectarian and political lines. We had mass defections from the Syrian Arab army that eventually created the Free Syrian Army and then later on splintered to various Syrian opposition groups. We had foreign powers rapidly militarizing the conflict. We had Turks, we had Russians, we had Iranians, Americans, Gulf power. Everyone was involved in the war. None of this is happening in Iran. The Iranian state right now controls its territory 100%. There is no large-scale opposition groups right now in Iran with military capabilities like what we've seen in Syria. No one is challenging the state's monopoly on violence. No one
Hmm.
wants to go through to that level yet. Yet,
Hmm.
I think time will tell. And you've made a good point on the ethnic and the regional diversity of Iran, and it's often cited. We're seeing a lot of analysts and writers talk about it, but diversity alone does not produce disintegration.
Hmm.
Unlike Syria, Iran's ethnic minorities are integrated into the state the way the Syrians were not. Kurds, Azeris, Arabs, Baluchis, they're all full-on Iranian citizens. Up until last week, Kurds were treated as a full part of the Syrian society. The ethnic minorities in Iran participate in national institutions. They serve in the military. They're embedded in the political economy. Right now, the president of Iran is a minority. He's an Azeri. Even the supreme leader, Ali Khamenei, he is an ethnic minority. He is Azeri. The grievances along ethnic lines exist. They're real, particularly in peripheral regions, but they're not translating into organized secessionist movements with mass appeal and foreign and external backing and funding. We're
Hmm.
not seeing we're not seeing the Kurds in Iraq or Syria or Turkey supporting the Kurds in Iran. We're not seeing the Gulf support the Ahwazi Arabs in Ahwaz. We're not seeing the Pakistanis support the Baluch. That does not exist right now.
Right.
And I think another key difference right now is the absence of foreign sponsorship for internal conflict, where global powers were involved. We had Russia, we had the US fighting ISIS, fighting extremist groups. These radical extremist groups don't exist in Iran right now. So I think with that said, dismissing all the risks nonetheless would be irresponsible because it's very hard to tell what could happen right now.
Right. Abdullah, you brought up a really interesting point, and I want to ask you more about the geopolitics at play here. Of course, you mentioned Russia and the United States, and I want to go beyond that actually because it's very clear. Um, because you've got US and Israel on one side, and their stance has been clear since day one. Then you've got Russia and China on the other side. Clearly, they've backed around through all these years. I want to know about the other players, the middle players, the ones who have a lot of push and pull, but they're not really talked about. And I want you to touch upon, of course, Turkey, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and even Azerbaijan, because given the amount of Azeris present in Iran, they have a crucial role to play here. So, can you tell us about these countries?
You make a very good point, and all the countries that you mentioned do have an interest and a disinterest in seeing Iran collapsing. If we're going to analyze the region in the Middle East region right now, traditionally we've had two horses in the race. We had the Saudi-led camp and the Iranian-led camp. Right now, there's three horses in the region. We have the traditional Iranian-led axis of resistance: Iran, Iraq, Lebanese Hezbollah, the Houthis. But the Saudi camp has splintered and fractured into two. We've seen two camps emerge in the region besides the Iranian camp. We have a Saudi, Pakistani, Turkish-led camp that includes Qatar, a very cautious Egypt, the Syrian government right now in Damascus, and some Gulf states tend to lean to it, but are not fully leaning to it, like Kuwait and Oman. And we have another camp that is basically an Israeli, Emirati, Greek entente that also includes India,
Mhm.
includes Morocco, includes Bahrain. So we're seeing these two camps converge and differentiate on the traditional scenes of conflict in the region right now, which includes Libya, Sudan, Yemen, Somalia, Syria. So I think they will still diverge and get into conflict on the way they will proceed in Iran right now. Geopolitics, in essence, it shapes what is happening in Iran more through constraint rather than direct intervention. I think it's too early to say when the direct intervention phase will come in. And unlike Syria or Libya or Yemen, Iran is not a permissive arena for external powers to openly pick sides or to militarize the internal unrest. The regional and global powers, they're watching carefully, they're prioritizing stability over disruption, even when behind the scenes they're supporting the protests. Now, this produces a geopolitical environment that will influence outcomes indirectly rather than decisively. So let's bring down Israel, for example. Israel views the Iranian instability primarily through the security lens, as it does with everything else. Its focus remains primarily on the Iranian nuclear program, which they have been talking about for decades. But in recent months, with the war in June 2025 and the conflict in 2024, Israel has had a direct interest in crippling Iran's ballistic missile and drone capabilities.
Hmm.
They have proven to be a very difficult method to intercept. We've seen that in June. And still, of course, Israel has a direct focus on the proxies that Iran has. So internal unrest is seen as potentially weakening Iran's long-term capacity, but it's also a factor that it could encourage risk-taking by a cornered leadership. The Iranian leadership right now, if it sees that the Israeli attack is pending, it might unleash all its missiles and drones, and that would be very hard for Israel to intercept. So Israel, rather than being confrontational right now, it's just studying the way how to approach, and it will eventually approach. Across the Arabian Gulf, with the Saudis and the Emiratis, they're looking at Iran with strategic caution. They both have deep concerns about Iran's regional behavior, but neither of them want to see Iran implode, in my opinion, especially Saudi Arabia. A civil war, fragmentation would destabilize the Gulf as a whole. It would disrupt the energy markets. It would create security nightmares. It would risk the stability that the Saudis want for their Vision 2030. And both of them, Riyadh and Abu Dhabi, have learned from a decade of regional turmoil that state collapse rarely produces favorable outcomes, especially the Saudis. They've seen the case with Iraq and Yemen, that is right across their borders, north and south. And I think digging deep into Saudi, it's especially notable because its recent engagement with Iran reflects a recognition that de-escalation serves its long-term interests. That doesn't mean it's allying or coordinating with Iran or it trusts it, but it rather means restraint. Now, publicly, the Saudi public statement is showing sympathy with the Iranian societal grievances, but they're not investing in the regime change. They've just declared that they do not want any American or Israeli aircraft crossing their airspace to strike Iran. Their priority is reducing the spillover and focusing basically on the domestic transformation to let the Iranian people take their course as is. The Emiratis have, as I said, allied with a different camp than the Saudis.
Yeah.
Still share that pragmatism, and the UAE, being the UAE as a commercial and financial hub, it benefits from predictability and regional calm more so than the Saudis. So an unstable Iran right now would create massive economic risk for Dubai, for the UAE. It won't create opportunity. I think for Turkey, which occupies a more complex region, much more than the Gulf, it is really wary of Iranian instability, especially that it shares a land border with Iran rather than a maritime border, as is with the Saudis or the Emiratis. And the Turks are particularly concerned, in my opinion, about the Kurdish dynamics, about refugee flows. Turkey already has a problem that lasts for the past half century with the Kurds. A reinforcement of a Kurdish conflict with now an Iranian front, because the Turks have been engaging with the Kurds not just in Turkey but in Syria and Iraq as well. A reinforcement of that with an Iranian front would be detrimental for Turkish grand strategy. The refugee flows for Turkey would be a nightmare because Turkey has taken Syrian and Iraqi and Afghan refugees by the millions, and it's recently recovering that. And now with a new influx of Iranian refugees, that would just set back the Turkish economic progress. So as a result, it's remaining be hands off regarding Iran's internal unrest so that it doesn't affect it internally. What unites all three countries that I just mentioned also is that they don't want conflict with Iran right now if the US and Israel strikes, because they know that if Iran were to retaliate, one of the major targets would be the American bases in all three countries, the American forces stationed in three countries. Turkey has a massive American base in the center of the country, in Sherlock. The Emiratis have Al Dhafra. The Saudis have American forces stationed across multiple bases in Saudi Arabia. Qatar has Al Udeid. American forces are stationed in Jordan, in Salty Air Base. That is the major point of concern, that these countries do not have to face Iranian retaliation, where the drones or missiles might not just strike those bases, they might strike massive infrastructure, cities, economic hubs, data centers that they're all talking about. So, in this sense, I think right now the neighborhood is really prioritizing stability rather than instability.
Brilliant analysis and an overview of what's going on, not just in Iran, but how other actors are also involved. But Abdullah, Iran is a developing situation. In fact, as we speak, the United States is carrying out a heavy military buildup around Iran. So I will have to call you for round two, and we'll have to discuss further on what really is happening in the region and why Iran is so important. Thank you very much, Abdullah.
Of course, Rohan. It was a pleasure to be here, and I look forward to our next conversation.
Absolutely.
Join the conversation at Fair Observer and subscribe to our YouTube channel.